And take it away, Charlotte.
Well, welcome everyone to our June Plants, Pests and Pathogens. It's great to have you here with us this morning. We're going to have a great presentation on managing perennial stems for pollinator habitat, which is really exciting because we know many of you help support that project by collecting stems from your garden or demonstration garden and sending them in to Elsa and Hannah so they could take a look and see what was inside of them. So we're going to hear all about the outcomes of that research project and citizen science project today. Following our key presentation from Elsa Youngsteadt and Hannah Levenson, we'll have Be on the Lookout, or BOLOs, where we hear about insect pests from Matt Bertone that we should be on the lookout for in our garden, and plant diseases, which Mike Munster will update us on. Then Caroline Richardson will close us out with some EMG program announcements. So we're really excited to welcome Elsa and Hannah to speak to us today again about this project that Master Gardener volunteers were involved in several counties across North Carolina. Elsa Youngsteadt is an associate professor in the NC State Department of Applied Ecology. She also got her PhD in entomology from NC State. And she does research in the areas of the effects of urbanization, climate change, and other anthropogenic changes on populations, communities, interactions, and ecosystem services. Her extension interests include urban biodiversity and pollinator conservation. Also presenting today, in fact, first up will be Hannah Levenson, and Hannah is a postdoctoral research scholar in the NC State Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology. She is a community ecologist interested in investigating how humans impact the environment and exploring ways to mitigate those impacts. She's also a bee expert with experience researching both native bees and honeybees. In fact, Hannah and Elsa authored a publication on bee identification and the bees of North Carolina. And Hannah is currently working with berry growers to better understand how pest management decisions impact pollinators. And as we turn it over to Hannah and Elsa, we have a poll that we want to get you guys to participate in. So I'm going to stop my share to allow Hannah to share. And our poll question should be up, and it says, in what month do you most often cut back dead perennial stems in your garden? See lots of responses coming in. That's great. We'll keep it going just maybe another 30 or 45 seconds or so. We definitely have a lead month, although seeing all throughout the year. Okay, the response rate's really slowing down. So I'd say let's give it 10 more seconds and then we'll close it out and share the results. Okay, so you should see the poll response on your screen, which shows that March is the lead month. So turning it over to Hannah and Elsa, was that what you were anticipating, or is that a good thing? You're going to let us know.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. We were interested to see with this group because it can be pretty different depending on who you talk to. And then I think there was a second poll question as well that we were going to do at the very beginning.
Sure, let me get that going. Okay, let's see, stop sharing. Back. There we go. Poll number 2. Here we go.
Thank you.
And that one says, in what season have you heard that it's best to cut back perennial stems to support overwintering insects? And you can here check all that apply. Guys are getting so good with polls. It's wonderful. It's really kind of fun. Okay, I'm gonna end that and share the results.
Thank you. Very, very
All
interesting.
right. Great, I'm just grabbing that. And now I'll leave it to you, Hannah.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for answering that poll. I think you'll see your answers reflected in this presentation. So, okay, we'll go ahead and get started. And those were just notes for us. So I'll start with why this project was happening. So I'm sure you all have had this question of, if I'm putting this habitat out there to help support wildlife, how do I best management to continue to do so, and then we don't harm the insects or the other wildlife that we're trying to support? And when we were looking into this, because we kept getting this question, we were finding some conflicting information online, and it was a little difficult to get at the right answer. So a lot of people are asking this. Some people say clean up in the fall, and that was reflected in the poll. That was the second most common season that people here recommended. Other people say wait until the spring, which was the most common answer you all gave. So that does seem to reflect that we're finding the same information that you all have been finding. And there has been some information going into more detail about how you could do this if you are going to trim back in the spring. But what Elsa and I found when we were looking into this is that a lot of this information is based on anecdotal evidence from someone's specific garden, or maybe it's an opinion they have based on other factors, but we weren't able to find actual data showing why there's a certain time of year that's better to clean up the garden or what effects that might have. So because all of us were so interested in this, we figured that we better go ahead and figure out for ourselves and actually do a project looking at when is the best time to clean up the garden. So that's what inspired the work that we are talking about today. And one big reason why this is such a great time to do this project is because there really is what I would call a pollinator boom, pollinator garden boom going on right now. Over the past 20 years, the acreages of habitats being planted by homeowners, agricultural areas, companies, landscapers, just everyone is really focused on getting some habitat back into the landscape. And that's really great because when we do this, we do see immediate benefits to our wildlife. And you can see the map showing all of the different pollinator gardens across the country and how extensive this network really is becoming. And there's even some organizations that are challenging us to put out even more acreage. So there's the Million Pollinator Garden Challenge, things like the Butterfly Highway. There's also different organizations where you can certify your wildlife habitat. So really just encouraging people to put this habitat out. And for most of the year, it could be really beautiful, like you can see in this bottom corner. But eventually, all of these plants will, no matter what species they are, go dormant and look a little bit more like this. And maybe if your neighbor is not planting a pollinator garden, this is not what they would expect to look at. And so probably we do need to be responsible with how we clean up and manage this in the landscape. But again, it gets back to that question of, when should we do this? When is the best time to best support this wildlife? And part of the difficulty in answering this is that if we are going to focus on pollinators in our pollinator gardens, so we'll talk mostly about bees here, bees can be really diverse, and the different species that are in the habitat can have different life cycles. You can see in this image, they come in all shapes, sizes, colors, and that can change what impacts our efforts and our actions have on each species. So an important first step is learning a little bit more about our bee species in North Carolina, and then how can we consider that when we're making management decisions. So to give you an idea of the diversity, in North Carolina, we have 564 different bee species. In North America, there are more than 4,000. And then in the world, there are more than 20,000. So they are a very diverse group of insects, and this can make them really exciting to learn about and work with, but it can also make it a little difficult because there are so many nuances, and we'll talk about that a little bit here. So when we're thinking about bee diversity, there's differences in size, where they live, how they live, and what they eat. And I'll go into this now. And it's important to keep these differences in mind in thinking about designing a pollinator garden and also managing it. So for size, bees can be very different in their size. So on the left-hand side of the screen, I'm showing the smallest bee in the world, Perdita minima. It is 0.08 inches long. It's called the fairy bee because it is so tiny. And then on the right-hand side, we have the largest bee in the world, Megachile pluto, which is 2.5 inches long. And if we were to set these species next to each other, this is how different they would look, their size. So very different. And we can expect to find a bee that is a size anywhere in between these two. And the thing about bees is when they emerge as adults, they are fully grown. So when you see a small bee, it's not because it needs to grow more, that's just a small bee. And so that can have impacts on what role they play in the landscape, what flower resources they're even able to visit. Next, we'll talk about where bees live. So there are 4 broad categories about the nesting material that bees can build their nests in. So first there's soil. So we have a female bee that will burrow straight underground. So under the ground where we walk, we may not even ever notice these nests. And off that main tunnel, she may have extensive other tunnels. She'll build cells where she lays an individual egg, gives it its food. That's where that develops into a new adult bee. And these can be anywhere from a couple inches to up to a meter or 2 underground, depending on the species. Next, we have wood. So some bees nest in sound wood. I'm sure we all have experience with carpenter bees, but they are pollinators and they do build their nests in sound wood. We also have other species that nest in more soft rotting wood, so depending on the species. Next, we have stem nesters. So what we'll highlight today, but those are leafcutter bees, mason bees, a couple other species we'll talk about later. And they live in hollow twigs or pithy twigs, and you can see they build their nest where they lay larvae next to each other until they fill up the whole twig or stem. And then we have cavity nesters, where they actually find a cavity and they build comb or other nest structure to fill that cavity, and that's where they lay their eggs and have their nest. And these are mostly honeybees and bumblebees that will build nests this way. And what you might notice is our cavity nesters, so honeybees and bumblebees, even though these are probably the species we know the most about, that we hear the most about, and that we probably know the most about how to support, they are less, species that build nests in cavities represent less than 1% of all of the 20,000 bee species that we have. So they're very unique in the bee world, very unlike the majority of other species. And on the other side, our ground nesters, 70% of bee species build their nests underground. And we know the less about these other nest materials, even though they represent the majority of bee species. So it's important that we start to learn more about what these other bee species need so that we can best support them. Okay, and then within those nests, bees can also live in different ways. And for sake of time, I'll keep this very brief, but we could go into more details if people have questions later. But what I'm showing you is a gradient, and I'm going to talk about 2 extremes, but there's a lot of variation in between. So I'm not telling you what all species will live like, just the 2 extremes. So on one side, we have solitary nesters. That is where female bees will nest alone. They build their own nest, lay their own eggs, collect their own food. They do not get help from other bees. And most of the time, they don't even meet the eggs that they're laying in their nest. So it's a very solitary lifestyle. On the other side of the spectrum, we have highly eusocial bees. So these are our honeybees, is a really good example. There could be tens of thousands of individuals living together. They have a division of labor where some are collecting food, others are taking care of the eggs, others are cleaning the nest, others are protecting it. They also then have overlapping generations where bees of different ages are all living together. They do have that one reproductive, that queen that is laying eggs. And most of the time, these nests are on a perennial life cycle where they last year after year after year, where our solitary bees are more on the annual life cycle. And again, there's lots of variations in between. These are the 2 extremes. But I want to highlight again the highly eusocial bees, the honeybees, bumblebees are also eusocial, represent less than 5% of bee species worldwide. But again, we know the most about these species and how to support them. Where solitary bee species represent more than 90% of all bee species. And remember, they are solitary, they don't have a queen, they don't get help from other bees. And so we know less about these bee species that live this way, and it would be good for us to learn more so that we can support them in our landscapes. Okay, then bees can be different in what they eat. So I'm showing you similar idea here, a gradient. I'm going to talk about the two extremes, but there's others in between I'm not going to talk about. So one extreme is specialist pollinators, where a bee species needs to visit a specific family, genus, or even species of plant to get the appropriate pollen and nectar resources to feed its young. And without those plants, those young would not successfully develop. The other side of the spectrum, we have generalist pollinators, where if a plant is producing pollen and nectar that a bee could collect, it can collect it and for the most part successfully raise its young on those resources. So with all of these, a really quick overview of all the nuances between different bee species, you can start to see how it's really important that we start to consider these differences when we make land management decisions, because what might be negative for one species may not have as big of an impact on the other, or what could be beneficial for one species may not help another species. So we really need to start to think about all these nuances and how do we piece them together to best support our pollinator communities in general. So bringing it back to our project here with the stem nests, we talked about all these differences between bee species. So I want to narrow it down to what we can start to think about and expect in pollinator gardens when we're thinking about stem nesting bees. So they're going to be stem nesters, like we talked about. So there's a couple key groups that will be stem nesters. Other bee species, bumblebees, honeybees, they are not our ground nesters. They are not going to be living in these stems. So we're already narrowing down the portion of the community that we're thinking about here. They're for the most part going to be solitary. So they're not going to live in big colonies with multiple bees working together. They're going to be individual bees building their own nests. For the most part, they're going to be generalist pollinators, so they are going to visit a wide variety of flowers. It's good for them to have many different flowers available that they can collect resources from. And they're going to be smaller bodied bees, so they're going to be on the smaller side of that scale that we talked about. So that also can change how we think about what resources we put out. Okay, and really quickly, just for sake of time, I want to quickly talk about the bee life cycle, because that will play a role in when we think about the time of year we need to trim back these stems. So all bees go through the same general life cycle, where there's an egg that has food with it, pollen and nectar, that was collected by the mother. It then develops into a larva, then into a pupa. It'll then emerge as an adult, remember, fully grown. Those adults, the females, will go out and forage. They will then mate with males and start building a nest, and the whole cycle starts all over again. And depending on the species, this cycle can be really quick, about a month, or it could take quite some time and take up to a year to complete. So that can also have a big impact when we're thinking about these nests and the bees developing in the stems. Is a species a quick developing species, 1 month, or is it going to take the whole year? And when we think about it in the stem, the same life cycle is happening. It's just happening in this linear fashion rather than a circle like I just showed you. And it actually happens back to front, since the bees have to fill the back end of the stem up to the front. The oldest larva is actually in the back, and this will develop into a pupa and then an adult first. And then it gets younger and younger at the front because the mom is just now laying the egg at the very front of the stem. Hopefully that makes sense, but we can talk about it more as we go through some of our results. So when we're thinking about the pollinator garden, you're letting your garden grow over the season, you're letting it go to seed so the birds and other wildlife can use it, and eventually you're going to trim it back. But when is that going to happen? That's the big question here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elsa. And Elsa, just let me know when you want to change slides, I guess, instead of changing.
Can I actually just share from my end? Can we swap?
Yes.
It'll take a
Yes.
second to switch over, but then I can see my notes. All right, and I think I've got it pretty well set up, so it shouldn't take me long. Getting there. Okay. So to get at this, well, first of all, Hannah, thanks for all of that sort of setup. Now we've fully set the stage and we kind of know who is the cast of characters that we're trying to support with our garden management. And now coming to the research that we actually did and are going to share with you today, we wanted to get at this question of when are your stems actually empty and therefore safe to cut? And like Hannah said, that's a question that we get a lot. And it actually, the group that spurred us to do this research was the NC State Extension Consumer and Youth Horticulture Working Group, which was also getting this question frequently and asked us if we could put together sort of a guidance document. And we were like, the research isn't really there, so let's do it. So the working group recruited participants in this project from across 10 counties throughout the state of North Carolina, including extension agents and master gardener volunteers. And we worked with 4 counties in the first year as a pilot and then 8 in the second year for a total of 10 counties represented by 9 agents, 18 volunteers, and 20 separate gardens. So at this point, obviously, there are a lot of people to acknowledge for participating in this project, specifically the members of the working group itself, the volunteers and extension agents who coordinated the sampling across the different gardens, and then the undergraduates in the lab who split thousands of stems to see what was inside. And then funding for the project for the supplies and the undergrad assistance also came from the working group. So what did the volunteers actually do? I'm going to walk us through the sampling protocol, and I want to make sure that that protocol is squarely rooted in kind of the seasonal timing of a garden that Hannah set up. So if you're thinking of your average perennial plant in the first year that it's actually going to bloom, it sort of starts the season by sending up some foliage. Maybe it flowers in the summer, then those stalks die back in the fall. And if you leave them undisturbed, then they remain dead on the plant throughout the winter. And then even throughout the following year, even as the plant is sending up new leaves and flowers again. So we're thinking about any given stem on a 2-year cycle here. And for the purposes of this project, we're not really interested in that first spring and that first summer. We're mostly not thinking about cutting back these plants when they are, brand new, fresh and flowering. But it starts to be the fall and the winter that you might start thinking about tidying up. And so our project is going to pick up here in the late fall of year 1 and follow those dead stems throughout the next 4 seasons. So to save some room on the slide, I'm actually going to ditch those first 2 seasons that we're not talking about. And the first step in this protocol happened at sort of point 0 on the timeline. That was late fall of the first year when each participating garden sort of prepped their garden by cutting back about 100 stems, just trimming them to a stubble of 18 to 24 inches. That wasn't actually part of our original plan, but we had gardeners concerned that intact plants would be so top heavy that they would just kind of fall over and they wouldn't be able to get samples from that same stem cohort throughout the year. So we started with this prep step, and any species of perennial plant was fair game. And then later that same winter, around February, before the last frost, with the sampling date adjusted to each county according to its sort of weather records. So late winter, around February, so any overwintering insects that are going to use those stems should still be tucked in there. And that's when volunteers collected their first sample of 20 to 30 stems taken from that cohort of 100 stems that they previously trimmed, but left in place in the garden. Then the second sample from the spring, depending on the location, that was collected in April or May. Again, it was another 20 to 30 stems from that original cohort of trimmed stems. And then another 20 or 30 in July or August. And then the fourth and final sample was collected in the late fall after first frost for the garden location. So when any insect that was going to overwinter in those stems should be back in there tucked in for the winter. And at this point, we're talking about stems that are a little more than a year old that flowered not the summer before, but 2 summers ago. So that was the sampling timeline. And all of our participants shipped their stems to us after each sampling event. And then we split them open to see what was inside. And if there were insects inside, we collected them to identify. And if those insects were immature, if they were larvae, we put them in an incubator to finish rearing them out so we could identify adults. Altogether, from the 20 participating gardens, we received a total of 68 samples and a total of 2,356 individual stems. And I have to say, before this project, I had never actually seen a nest in a stem. Like, we know they exist, but they did feel a little bit mythical, and we were terrified that, like, with all this work, we would find like one nest. But it turns out when you open up 2,000 plus stems, you actually do find things. And here are just a few examples of some of the nests that we found inside the stems that the volunteers submitted. And sometimes we actually found adult bees inside too, with or without nests. And so overall, the total number of stems that was occupied out of the 2,000 plus that we received was 35. That's not a lot, it's about 1.5%. But we did find needles in our big haystack. And those occupied stems originated from 12 out of the 20 participating gardens and 22 out of the 68 garden season combinations. And the total number of occupied stems goes up to 41 if you count ones that had dead residents, like nests that maybe weren't successful but still had parts in them that we could identify. So those dead samples didn't help us with understanding the seasonality of the garden, but they did help us understand sort of who uses stems and which stems do they use. So including those, altogether we found 12 species of bees and solitary wasps in the stems, 9 species of bees, 3 species of wasps, and we found them in 20 different kinds of plant stems. And by kinds, I mean species or cultivars. And by far, the most frequent occupants, insect occupants in these stems were bees in the genus Seratina, the small carpenter bee. You might also hear it pronounced Seratina. I'm stubborn, I still call it Seratina. And we found there's 6 species of Seratina in North Carolina. We found 5 of them, and together those 5 species accounted for 68% of the occupied stems. We also found a few leaf-cutting bees in the genus Hoplites and Megachile. We found some yellow-faced bees, also known as cellophane bees in the genus Hylaeus, and then a handful of different kinds of solitary wasps. And although we're focusing on the bees today, I do want to mention that these wasps are also good neighbors in your garden. These are solitary wasps. They're sort of docile insects, and they hunt caterpillars and crickets to feed their offspring, whereas bees use pollen. These wasps, hunt for meat. But they're also like fairly elegant and interesting neighbors. It doesn't have to be all about the bees. But since Seratina was the most common, I want to spend a moment looking at this group of bees. So they are cousins to the better known large carpenter bee, the one that is drilling holes in your deck and your fence posts. But Seratina are tiny. They're really kind of on the scale of like a large ant. And they make their nests exclusively in pithy stems, not in your deck. And then they use the pith that they hollow out of those stems to actually make the walls between the nest chambers. So what you're seeing here is cross sections of the nests from stems that we split. And similar to that illustration that Hannah showed, we have each separate nest chamber has an egg or a larva in it and enough pollen to bring it through its entire development. And then the partitions between those chambers are what the mom bee makes out of the pith that she hollowed from the stem. And so we found 5 out of the 6 species of Seratina that even occur in North Carolina, and they share some kind of similar traits. So I'm going to lump them just so you kind of get to know who are these common residents in your garden. And overall, I would like to say, get excited. They're pollinating all of your garden plants. We don't actually know that about this kind of bee. They're pretty neglected in pollinator research, probably because they are little and they're not very hairy. So they're always going to be overshadowed by super pollinators like bumblebees, but they do have potential. And even in some countries like outside of North America, different species of Seratina have been shown to have an economic role in pollination of certain crops. Here, we just don't know, but they do have potential because the adults are active throughout the growing season. So they, and they're floral generalists. They'll visit lots of kinds of flowers. So they're there and they're available to pollinate many different plants throughout the year. So don't write them off completely as pollinators. But their bigger claim to fame is actually their social organization. They are on the solitary end of the spectrum, but they're not as solitary as most. because they have this interesting pattern of maternal care. So most solitary bees, once they, lay an egg and build a little wall to wall it off, they never see that baby again. But a Seratina mom actually goes back through, she'll break down the partitions she previously built and go visit her kids and groom them. And that grooming actually helps reduce fungal infections. And then she actually sticks around as once her larvae emerge as adults too, and often sort of prods the first daughter to go out and become a forager on behalf of the whole family. And she goes out and forages and brings food back to her brothers and sisters so that they're then fat enough to survive the winter. And then the whole family overwinters together in the nest. And then in the spring, sort of February, March, they disperse out to find a new place to nest. So that should give you a general sense of kind of who some of our common residents were. The other big question is which plants, well, another big question is which plants were they using? Like if you wanted to increase the value of your garden for nesting bees, kind of what are some plants you might want to add? So what I'm going to show you here is a little matrix of who nested in which stems. So on the left, we have our occupant, starting with the most common group, Seratina, and then across the top, we have the different genera of stems. And the darker squares represent the largest number of stems. So for Seratina, the most stems were in, or the most nests were in Solidago, in goldenrod, and then there were also a bunch in ironweed and sage and echinacea. They all use pithy stems because they have to have it for making their partitions, and they're little bees, so they use little stems. The average stem diameter, the average sort of diameter of the pith that they had hollowed out was about 3/32 of an inch, and as little as a 1/16 of an inch. So don't write off tiny stems as a habitat. Moving on to the wasps, we tended to find solitary wasps in larger stems that were hollow rather than pithy. They don't use the pith the way Seratina does. And so they were common in Eutrochium, Asclepias, Brumansia, Eryngium. Their tunnel diameters were bigger. The hollows that they were using were on average 7/32, or a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch. And we could go on. We found a smattering of these other species, but maybe not enough to make strong statements about what they were using. And overall, this study wasn't designed to detect preference. We can't say that Seratina likes Solidago better than anything else, but we can definitely say that this is a stem that is used. I also realized this genus level list might not be completely satisfying to all our gardeners. I'm not going to give you a complete list here. Please ask us if you would like to see it, but a few highlights of specific species within those groups that were occupied included purple coneflower, Joe pieweed, tall boneset, scarlet bee balm, regular bee balm, New York ironweed, tall goldenrod, and rough goldenrod. So that's all great. You got a sense of kind of who's in the garden, what plants they're using. I haven't actually talked about the original question here that Hannah set up. When were these stems occupied? When can you tidy them up without trashing these friendly neighbors? And so I'm going to show you the results in a graph that is aligned across its horizontal axis here with the seasons, and then the vertical axis is the probability of finding bees in a sample, meaning one, like that set of 30 stems from one garden in one season, the probability of finding at least one occupied stem in that sample during each season. In winter, the first winter that a stem was, like, it bloomed the summer before, and then that first winter that stem was no longer alive, we found absolutely 0 bees or wasps using stems at that stage. Then in spring, still following that same cohort of stems that had been alive the previous summer, now 70% of those samples had at least one occupied stem. So this was prime nesting season. Then we continued to find nests into the summer with 55% of them occupied. And then in the fall, things did start to drop off a little bit, but there were still some occupied stems, and the insects who are in them are the ones who are going to use those stems for overwintering. And so again, the stems that we're talking about at this point are over a year old. They're now from 2 growing seasons ago, not the previous growing season. And so the results so far suggest that it actually is safe to cut stems, but only in their first winter. And after that, they could be occupied at any point after their first winter. So you actually shouldn't be cutting them back after that point. But we did still have one misgiving. Like, remember how we added that preparatory step where all of the gardens cut their stems back to 18 to 24 inches to help them last longer throughout the study? Well, what if during that step, if there had been insects overwintering out in the tips of those plants, they would have just been cut off and we would have missed them in our sampling. And that didn't really seem logical, but before we come here and started saying, like, you can cut back in the first winter, we wanted to check one more thing. So we asked our volunteers for one more set of samples. And this time we requested stems only from a subset of the gardens where we had been seeing bees throughout the earlier part of the study. And this time we asked them to send stems in their first winter, but now the entire above ground part of the plant, so that we could see what was in that plant and what was in the parts that might get cut off if you followed this protocol of cutting back, trimming your stems to 18 to 24 inches tall in their first winter. So for this part of the study, we got 7 samples and 307 total stems, and none of those were occupied, confirming that it is safe to cut stems in their first winter. There is a little bit of a footnote, which I'm going to skip over now for timing for the most part, but one of those samples, sort of by happenstance, did have some stems that had been cut back earlier in the growing season, and those in fact were occupied. So once the stem is cut, it does become potential habitat. So going back to kind of what you find on the internet, some of this well-meaning advice to wait later into the spring to cut back your stems would actually be counterproductive for bees and solitary wasps. So what are we saying you should do instead? We'll use this seasonal cycle one more time, and now year 1 is across the top, and then year 2 is across the bottom. And we're saying that you should really trim stems in their first winter. Give them some time, let the birds have a crack at the seeds, but cut them back before last frost. You want those cut-ins to be available as soon as overwintering bees do wake up in the spring and are ready to start their new nests. So don't wait until it warms up to cut your stems. And you can do it safely because in that first winter, there's nobody home yet. And then once the stems are cut, bees and solitary wasps will immediately start occupying them. And so at that point, nests are possible throughout the year, and it's not safe for the bees for you to remove those stems. Instead, you can just let them naturally break down. Already by fall, volunteers were telling us they were having some trouble finding the cohort of stems from the previous year, and they'll continue to break down on their own without any extra help from you, and the bees will naturally stop using them. And overall, this practice increases habitat compared to alternative practices. If you didn't cut your stems at all, they would get some natural wear and tear over the winter that would create openings for bees to use. But by trimming, you greatly accelerate that process and maybe also keep things looking tidier. If you were to cut the stems all the way to the ground and remove them, you wouldn't be throwing away bees if you did that in the first winter, but also those stems would never have the opportunity to become habitat. So trim the stems in the first winter, then leave them alone. And so we hope that this kind of new advice will help you, tidy up your garden with confidence, knowing what the bees are up to during the different seasons, and that you can actually sort of enjoy hosting them in your garden this way. A quick side note that if those of you who actually sent us stems are here in this webinar, stay tuned, keep an eye out. We have a volunteer survey coming your way soon. This will be kind of the final step in this project to help us improve future participatory research projects. For now, I want to go ahead and launch poll 3 and Hannah and I can take any questions that you have for us. And if you want to wait and answer the poll, if you've got questions for us that will change your answer to the poll, then you can go ahead and ask them, and I'll stop sharing so we can see each other.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hannah and Elsa. The third poll is up now for you all. So you might need to just find that window if it was minimized while you're watching. And it's the question, how likely are you to change your garden management practices or recommendations as a result of what Elsa and Hannah just shared with us today? So thanks to everybody who is voting and responding.
And I'm seeing some questions in the chat. I can go ahead and try and field some of those. The first one I see is, can truly unwieldy stems be cut down partially and left on the ground? If there were larvae in there, could they still hatch? And I think we are suggesting cutting down those unwieldy stems, or at least cutting them back to a wieldy length, but just doing it in that first winter when we know there's nobody living inside yet. And so then the parts that you cut off the top, you don't really have to worry about because there's nobody in there. And then the part that's left behind should be, you know, kind of a fairly subtle stubble that will disappear among the new growth the following year, but still be available for nesting.
And can I quickly add one comment to that? So if you do have a concern and you are going to leave something on the ground in your garden, if something's in there, it could emerge. It's then a little more prone to maybe predators coming to get it, but it's also very unlikely that it would be reused if it's laying on the ground. It's like the bees are going to go to the upright stems. So it could be a way to kind of phase it out of the garden without getting rid of the nest completely, but it does change how the bees would be likely to use it.
And it also creates a much moister environment. Like fungus is the number, probably fungus and parasitoids are like the two top enemies of stem nesting bees. And anything that makes that environment damper is going to probably lead to more fungus. Somebody asked if we checked any native grasses. We didn't. I think one of our gardens did send us some little blue stem, and we didn't find anything in those nests. But it's not out of the question that grasses would get used too. Did you say that you can trim before or after the first frost? I would wait until after the first frost, when you know that kind of everybody has found where they're going to be for the winter. They're all sort of situated, and then like you can get at those stems and make them available for the following spring by trimming them. It's not super critical for the bees. Just know that once a stem is cut, it is potentially occupied. So once it's been trimmed once, you don't want to mess with it ever again. And our recommendation to wait until the winter is more like for the birds, so that those seeds are there and available as a resource to other wildlife before you worry about creating the nesting habitat for bees. How do bees move through the later laid eggs and larvae without disturbing these later laid eggs? So this is a fun one. Different species do it in different ways. Like the little Seratina that I talked about, the older little sister who forages for everybody else, she emerges first, and she does just like pick her way past all of her younger siblings, and she just does it without damaging them. She kind of tears down the partitions and goes out. Other species, the bees in the back do take longer to develop. They usually put the females in the back and the males in the front, and the males develop faster than the females. So even though the bees in the back started first, they don't finish first. And so sometimes for some species, you just see a fairly coordinated emergence, even though they all started at a different time. Hannah, do you see any of these that you want to?
Well, I was gonna say that we are still working on summarizing these results. A lot of the graphics you saw, we just got in and we're very excited about, but we do have a summary that Charlotte has posted on the extension website, and maybe we could find that link really quick to share with you all in the meantime. But we do hope to publish more thorough summary of everything.
Yes, I will find that link and put it here in the chat. And then as a reminder to everybody, when I send the follow-up email from today with the recording, that link will be there too. So that's a good reminder.
Thank you. Yeah, this is still hot off the press. Like I just identified most of those bees yesterday, and we're working on writing it up. And that's definitely the goal, to get you kind of a quick one-pager, and then also to publish the whole thing along with the volunteer experience survey, like in an extension journal, in case other states or groups wanted to find out something similar.
And then there's one more question I saw about the optimal stem length. So we're recommending 18 to 24 inches. I will say that most of the nests that we cracked open are shorter than that. But you never know what species is going to nest in that. And then also they do need to have the protection from moisture and predators on the ground. So we're recommending 18 to 24 inches for stem length.
That's another piece of research somebody could do at some point to see if there's actually a preference. But at this point, we're guessing. And with 1.5% of stems getting occupied, it will take a lot to get a real preference.
True. Do you ever see more than one species in a stem? Yes, this is actually interesting. It's not very common. And then we're talking about the stems themselves aren't common. So it's a less common activity of a less common activity. So it's, yeah, there's only a few stems, but I have seen some where multiple species will nest in there, or it's a wasp and a bee and the stem is kind of split half and half. Not totally sure how that's happening or how they're finding these already occupied nests and building on top of, but also if the stem is there multiple seasons, multiple species could use it. So there's a lot of interesting questions that I don't know the answers to, but yeah, that could happen.
Well, lots of great compliments coming in. Thank you so much, Hannah and Elsa, for today. Really interesting topic. Also really fun that so many Master Gardener volunteers were involved. So it must feel good for those that sent their stems and mailed them off to hear from you both. And just wonderful for us to learn about what's going on out there and what we can do in our gardens. So I'm going to turn it over to Charlotte now because she does want to remind everybody about your book that you co-authored, which everyone will find very helpful.
Yeah, so you can see on the screen, this is the Bees of North Carolina, what the cover looks like. There's just a little, clip from the type of detail you get in there. This is actually available. You can download it as a free publication, or you can purchase it as a book. So we encourage everybody to check that out and learn more about the bees of North Carolina. I also wanted to mention, I have changed the way I manage perennial stems in my landscape because of this project. And I'm finding now I have some of those second year stems, that started 2 years ago. And they really do start to disintegrate about this time of year. So if folks are worried about just this endless, standing forest of dead stems, nature really takes care of that for you. And what I'm finding in my garden is, as they start to age out, they just naturally fall down and then break down and just become part of the mulch and feed the plants. And so it's just a wonderful cycle to see and be able to support. So thank you so much to Hannah and Elsa for this research and for letting us be involved. We really appreciate and enjoy being involved in these type of projects. With that, we are going to move forward to our Be on the Lookout or BOLOs for July, coming up for July. And Matt Bertone is, fortunately, he's on a vacation right now, so he's having a great time, but he has recorded his BOLOs and shared them with us. So I'm going to start playing that. And after we listen to Matt's, we will move on to Mike.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. Sorry I can't be there virtually in person today. I'm actually on a family vacation out in Oregon. Weather's beautiful. Been seeing some good stuff, some giant redwoods, and hopefully it's good in North Carolina. You all are staying cool and enjoying the beginning of summer. So today I'm going to talk to you about some arthropod bolos, and these will be for late June and early July. The first one is going to be cicadas. Now, of course, you've heard a lot about cicadas this year, but those were in reference to the periodical cicadas. Now, at this point of the year, we're going to get our typical summer, annual, or dog day cicadas. These are the much larger brown, green, and black cicadas that fill the skies with and the surroundings with that familiar summer sound of the cicadas screeching. These large insects feed on the plants but are not pests. But you may also notice the activity of a related insect coming out too, and that is the cicada killer wasps. So these are our largest wasps, and they have to be because they hunt, paralyze, and bury annual cicadas, which themselves are very large insects. And so at this time of year, and I've already seen them around campus, there are these large cicada killer wasps coming out and about. Typically, they're going to be very active around certain spots of ground where they're going to nest together in the ground. Now, they don't form a colony, but it's more like an apartment complex with the females going out and catching cicadas and paralyzing them to bury for their young, and the males sometimes guarding territories. Now, although these wasps are very large and may be kind of fearsome looking, they are quite harmless. They're not aggressive, and their venom and sting are less than a bee sting, and I've never heard of anybody getting stung. So if you have these around your yard, I would say I would be happy if I did, because they're a good sign of a native ecosystem. They're very interesting wasps, and you can only see them this time of year. Now, of course, throughout the year, the creatures that were much smaller and not noticeable earlier in the year may be growing bigger. So you're going to see some full-grown wheel bugs. These are our largest assassin bugs. There's very large cog or a buzzsaw kind of on the back. They can bite if mishandled. So just, watch from afar, but they're not dangerous, they're not aggressive, but they are beneficial predators. You may also start to see the fall webworms. These are tent-making caterpillars. They're very fuzzy, and they make the tents in these nests in the branches of trees, various trees they'll feed on, and they'll strip the leaves off these plants. Now, typically, even though they may be an unsightly nuisance, they're not going to harm these trees, especially if they're healthy. The bags can be ripped open with a pole trimmer, or branches. If they're caught early enough with a small nest on it, they can be pruned out completely and destroyed. And we have more information on a fact sheet online if you'd like to take a look. Now, speaking of caterpillars, there are going to be a lot of other caterpillars out and about. They're going to be feeding on various types of plants in your garden, in your yard. The type of plant will dictate what type of caterpillar might be present. So you may have things like cabbage worms, which are present on some of the crucifers, and your cucurbits, your vine, your squash, and things like that may be invaded, unfortunately, by squash vine borers that can actually really harm the plants by boring into the base of the plant. But keep an eye out for various caterpillars that are out on your plants. Most can be hand removed and killed. If you want a very non-toxic way to do it, it does require more work than using some sprays. And there are various sprays out there for controlling caterpillars. But good scouting at different times of day and night, if you're seeing damage, to look for the culprits is really going to be important. Now, June beetles. So June is getting away from us. The June beetles are going to come out. These are large greenish bronze colored beetles. Their larvae were in the ground since last year. They are now pupating. They're going to emerge as these adults. They're very fast flyers. They actually remind me of wasps when they're flying. In fact, they can close their elytra, those wing covers, while their wings are still out, which makes them very streamlined and good flyers. So you may see these buzzing around fields, and the larvae are going to be feeding on roots and things like that in the soil. They're not often a pest, although the June beetles themselves, the actual adults, really like overripe fruits. So if you have ripe figs or berries or things like that, they're often attracted to them, and they'll kind of use that nose to break them open and feed on the liquids. So netting can help, and just kind of making sure that you're keeping an eye on those fruit, maybe picking them before they get overripe, can very much help. And of course, lots of other critters are going to be getting bigger. So many things are coming out once a year. You're going to start seeing praying mantises now because they were very young and small earlier in the year. They're getting bigger and more noticeable. You're going to get these black and yellow garden spiders are going to be more noticeable. Very beautiful native species. Some people call them writing spiders. And so a lot of these different critters are going to be getting to be the full size, really going to start to reproduce, and many of them die out at the end of the year and will overwinter as a different stage. And speaking of spiders, especially this black and yellow garden spider and these orb weaving spiders, these very large orb weaving spiders, a lot of people have been hearing about, and there's a lot of news about the Joro spiders. And I want to talk today very briefly on the Joro spiders and their native lookalikes, because we've also been getting a lot of photos through the clinic of spiders that people are mistaking for Joro spiders that are actually a native spider, very typical for our area. Um, and uh, and so let's start off with the actual Joro spiders first. So Joro spiders, Trichonephylla clavata. That was autocorrected, that spelling. But this is the one that people are talking about. It's a very large spider. It's a non-native spider, but still harmless, even though it's very large. And they do get very large. So the females are up to 2 inches with a several inch leg span, about a 3 or 4 inch leg span. And the males are much smaller. You can see the male on the top of that one photo. So the males are about the size of some of our native spiders, similar looking spiders. And another thing to look for are the bright yellow bands on the legs and the bright yellow bands on the abdomen of the female. Uh, they also will build a vertical web and they'll hang upside down in the center. So that's very key. There's a key characteristic of these. Um, these are not noticed until late summer and early fall. And so if you're seeing them out there, it's probably unlikely, or maybe you've caught a young one. But right now, we're not going to see the very large ones until the mid to late summer, early fall is when they're going to attain their largest size. And we do expect them to be all over the place. There are records even from Maryland and West Virginia, and they were originally found in Georgia about 9 years ago and have been steadily spreading. But again, even though they're very large and scary looking, they are harmless to humans. And we have a lot of information. If you search Joro spider and NCSU, you're going to find a lot of information on Joro spiders in general. Now, some of our native spiders that look like that include the orchard spiders. So orchard spiders are a close relative. They're kind of somewhat close relatives, close cousins. These orchard spiders are in the genus Leucauge, and they are native and harmless too. They're fairly small-bodied spiders. The body plus the legs is usually less than an inch or around an inch, and they're very beautiful spiders, and they have this silvery abdomen with markings on it. They typically have green legs. Otherwise, now these hang up upside down in their webs too, but their webs are actually horizontal or a little oblique. So they're not going to be vertical webs hanging upside down with the head down. They're going to be hanging upside down with the body in a horizontal manner with the web. These are noticed and mature early in the year. We're already seeing them. I'm seeing them in my yard. And they are somewhat similar looking to a Joro spider, but will never get bigger than that, about an inch long or so. And here's one hanging in its web upside down. Again, they're on this flat web that they hang upside down under. You can see that silvery look and the gold and whatnot. And Leucauge venusta is the common species in most of the state. As you get to the coast and the Gulf states, you get another species. I'll show that in a second. But one other characteristic that really helps identify this genus, the orchard spiders, is on the hind leg, the base of the hind leg, are these rows of fine eyelash-like hairs. You can see them on both sides of this, and we'll actually see them in the next photos too. But that's a really good way to identify this genus of spider. Now, our common one, Venusta, has this wholly silver abdomen with these markings, but we also have another species, like I said, near the coast and the Gulf states that has these orange markings on it, and that's Leucauge agarobapta. And again, you can actually see these eyelash like hairs here on the hind legs here and on this one, but you can see those little orange spots on the tip of the abdomen that's more common for this other species. And finally, there's another look-alike. I don't see it very often. I've seen the eggs in my yard. I still need to get photos of these, but this is called the Basilica orb weaver, another close relative of all three of the other two types. These are native. They are harmless. They're about the same size as the orchard spiders, so small to medium body, about an inch long total. The whole spider. The abdomen has bright markings. It's not as silvery, but it does have some bright markings I'll show you. And these are very confusing, these Basilica orb weavers from the orchard spiders. Even I get confused and I have to look them up often to make sure I can tell the difference. These also hang upside down in a horizontal web under a dome, and it's got a very complex web, and I'll show you that in a second. Now, one of the most distinct characters of this spider is the egg sac. So the egg sac is really it's kind of these vertically stacked balls, and I'll show you those in a second as well. And so sometimes people only see those, and once you see that egg sac, you know it's from the Basilica orb weaver. And these also are another one that are going to be noticed more earlier in the year, mid-year maybe, and as they mature a little bit earlier than the Joro spiders. And so a couple more photos of the Basilica orb weaver. So here's the markings on the back. It's a very pretty spider as well. And here you can see those stacks. This is only a 2-stack, but here's a much larger stack of the egg sacs that the females produce. And so they stack them on each other. And we've got a lot of these submitted to the clinic saying, what is this thing in my plant? Is it going to be harmful? And of course, this is just one of those egg sacs from the Basilica orb weaver. And finally, just to show you what the web looks like, they have this very disorganized web on top and around this kind of dome-like sheet that they rest underneath. And so those are some native lookalikes that might be confused for drawer spiders. Again, if you get questions about drawer spiders, you can always feel free to send in photos, but these might help you identify some of those native lookalikes. And I hope you all have a great day and great beginning of the summer. And I will see you here back in July when we give a main talk. So thanks everyone, and talk to you later.
All right, great. Now we will welcome Mike Munster to share his screen and take it away with disease beyond the lookouts for the coming month.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Caroline. Matt scared me a little bit there. He said we will be doing the main presentation next month, but I'm pretty sure he meant him
Yes, he
as
did.
far as the main presenter on PPP. So you'll have me for BOLOs today and hopefully for BOLOs again in a month. And as Matt was saying, we're just beginning summer, at least astronomically, but it sure feels like we're well into it. I mean, the crepe myrtles have been blooming since when, and the mimosas and things. But I did want to start by talking a little bit about the weather. Let me share my screen. So I went and looked at the weather records for the month of June through yesterday for several areas here in North Carolina and confirmed my suspicions that things have been very dry. In fact, none of the places that I looked was at above normal for that period of time for the month of June. Excuse me. And most places are well below half of what the normal would be. The Raleigh-Durham reading is a little bit misleading because about 80% of that 2 and change inches came on one day. So, and of course, how much of that soaked in and how much ran off. But yes, we are in a very dry situation. And I'm not a hydrologist, but I decided I was going to go look and see what the drought monitor looked like. And as of the most recent one, they're just showing maybe about a little over half of the state as abnormally dry. So not in actually the drought categories yet, but that's something to definitely be on the lookout for and concerned about. And in that spirit, I want to talk about some of the things that may be happening in our trees. I basically copied this, or much of this, from a presentation that I did in 2010 when we had a very hot, dry year, and on PPP I talked about heat and drought stress on trees. So again, to go over some of the risk factors, one of course is recent transplanting, and remember that a tree needs about a year to establish per inch of diameter at transplant. So if you're planting a 2-inch diameter tree, then expect it's going to take 2 years to become completely established. And make sure during the establishment phase that you're giving the watering deeply enough so that that root system is really benefiting when there's dry weather, when you haven't had enough rainfall. Other factors that you may not have as much control over would of course be heat from pavement. If you're in, let's say, a parking lot island or some such environment, and a poor root system, and that can come about from factors that would be, let's say, if in the nursery a girdling root started, or excuse me, it was root bound in a pot at some point, you may have a problem there. And there's some good recommendations from Barbara Fair on her videos about planting trees, how to try and treat that root ball so that you can prevent or minimize those kind of problems in the future. A few examples of trees and their symptoms from drought stress. Notice on the sycamore here, the large brown to yellow blotches on the foliage, and then a lot of leaf drop happening there under the canopy. Again, these are pictures from 2010. Our yellow poplars typically, even when it's not a particularly dry year, will late in the summer with some dryness will show the fall coloration. So that is not uncommon to see on the yellow poplar, the tulip poplars. With river birch, one of its defenses is dropping those leaves, shedding some of the foliage. So you may notice under the trees, the leaf drop. This picture, so much has changed in the last 14 years here. So on the left, that's actually the former Harrelson Hall, which was replaced by a nice garden area, and then is now been replaced by the construction of the new Integrated Sciences building. Excuse me. So it looks very different here now. Those trees are gone. And of course, dogwood gets a scorch-like symptom in the hot, dry parts of the summer, which, if you look carefully, could be confused with something else. And let's see, double check the chat here and see if anybody wants to take a stab at what that might be happening on the dogwood leaves on the right. Nope. All right. Well, if you look carefully, you can see in the oh, someone said fire blight. Nope, wouldn't be fire blight. That's going to be on rosaceous hosts, mainly pear. We have seen a lot of fire blight, by the way, this year. Mainly pear, but also apple, not on peach though. And dogwood would not get it. Yes, Charlotte, this is powdery mildew. So here we have the fine covering of the mildew that you can see when you hold the leaf at an angle up to the light. That's the trick, because it's not always that thick in the midsummer on dogwood as a host. But then you get, apart from that sign of the fungus, you get these symptoms of the sort of blotchiness that occur, which I assume is because the leaf is losing more water when it's infected than if it were not. So yes, that is powdery mildew. As far as our herbaceous plants, flower garden, vegetable garden, and so on, if you go to chapter 5 in the Extension Gardener Handbook, you'll see a key there, and I've just taken a screenshot of part of it, where you can kind of go through some diagnostic steps to tell what's going on, because it could be anything from insects, and Matt mentioned the squash vine borer. That's why my squash are wilting every day, and leading up to other problems that you may have in, let's say, the roots from root rots, nematodes, also vascular problems. So some of those can't be diagnosed on site, but you'll get an idea of some of the things that you may be dealing with here in that diagram, or that dichotomous key. Switching now to the other BOLOs for the month of July and now late June. We talk about this every year. It's a kind of a high summer sort of disease. Not that it's not present year round, because the tree is going to be infected perennially. So we have a red bud. You can see the photograph there on the left. That, wow, we have photos going back. I'd have to look, at least the tree being symptomatic, over a dozen years, I think. So it's a situation where the bacteria are in the xylem of the tree, leaves out beautiful in the spring, but then by midsummer it starts to get the scorch symptoms on it. Likewise with oak. And I checked out both this tree and a known infected oak next to the library here. When was it? It was last week, and they were both symptom-free at this point. The reason I went to check that was because I had checked on an elm tree that we knew was infected, and that already has symptoms on it. That's the tree that you see on the right-hand side of the screen there. And if you look closely at those leaves, you can see the typical scorch symptoms from the margins, and kind of a multi-tone effect there on the border of the necrotic or dead tissue. So with elm, and it's only been the last couple of years that we've been aware, at least I've been aware of it on elm in North Carolina. Why it took so long to show up in that host, I don't know, but it's something that you'll have to add to your BOLOs now, to include elm on your list of things to be aware that might have bacterial leaf scorch. We'll also want to be on the lookout for slime flux on our hardwoods, especially on white oak, in which case it's usually very low to the ground. A neighbor in front of us has, I'm not even sure what kind of tree it is, but another kind of tree. It's on a white oak, and the flux is happening maybe about chest height on the trunk there. And it may seem just to be a dark stain, or you may see actually the frothing of the flux coming out of it. You may see butterflies, wasps, other insects attracted to that flux. This is because of the fermentation of sap, and it's not particularly, well, it's not anything to worry about. It is actually microorganisms fermenting the sap, but it's not going to be detrimental to the health of the tree in the long term. So there's really no treatment to be taken there when you see this, although some people may try and tell you that it needs to be treated in some way. Powdery mildews will be showing up. We talked about that in crepe myrtle in our presentation last month. A dogwood we just mentioned, euonymus, leucothoe, rose, possibly, and spirea. I saw powdery mildew, and it maybe doubly want to mention it when I saw in the presentation about Vernonia, ironweed, and I saw powdery mildew on ironweed, and it just right up next to the north side of one of our buildings here on campus that had some powdery mildew on. Also, there's rust already starting to show up on that. And with many trees and shrubs, poor planting, being root bound, or having girdling roots could be some things that are going on there. For the tomatoes, we could be starting to see septoria leaf spot, which starts out as small spots but can do quite a bit of damage, usually starting in the lower portion of the plant and moving up. So you can remove those as you go to try and keep a little bit of ahead of the disease and reduce the amount of fungus you've got there. On the other hand, if you have tomato spotted wilt virus, those spots are going to be showing up even on the young foliage. And of course, that's a systemic infection. And as the fruit matures, you may see some of these, or the fruit develops, you may see some of these spots that are there as well. Southern bacterial wilt, of course, also root knot nematodes, possibly southern stem blight would be other causes of problems in tomato, all of them causing wilting. And that wilting may start out as temporary. So it may wilt in the heat of the day and then recover, and you think, okay, things are going to be all right. And then the next day it wilts more, and eventually it progresses to the point where the plant does not recover. Cedar apple rust is going to be quite noticeable now with the bright orange and yellow spots on the leaves of apples and crab apples. I'm not 100% sure this was cedar apple rust in this particular example that came in a couple of years ago. There are one or two other gymnospermgium rust that it could have been, but that was most likely cedar apple rust. And if you look at, I haven't seen this stage yet. It hasn't quite developed to this point this year where, at least on the tree that I know it, my mechanics, a tree that's planted very close to a juniper, so it just alternates back and forth every year. But you'll see these kind of tattered looking edged pustules on the underside of the leaf where the esiospores are produced that blow over and infect the junipers if they're lucky. Last year in June on PPP, I showed some photos of a surprise that there was armillaria fruiting already that time of year. And this year I've got another "how is this possible" slide where there's already on a root, this again on campus, of this giant willow oak already with fruiting bodies of Pseudoinonotus dryadius. So it's the weeping polypore, and this is a serious wood rotter that can cause the loss of structural strength there in those buttress roots and make the tree more susceptible to wind throw. So like little loaves of bread coming out, they may have little droplets of moisture on the surface in the morning. So perhaps to be on the lookout for, even though you might not expect it this early. All right. If you have a taste for more BOLOs, again, go to our website, pdic.ces.ncsu.edu. On the left-hand menu bar, click on BOLOs and then click on the month of your choice. So with that, let me stop sharing and
Mike, I wonder if you'd put in the chat for all of our benefit, what was that on the willow oak, the last slide? What did you call that,
Sure.
please? Thank you. And
That was the
while you're looking
weeping
at the chat, yeah.
polypore.
While you're looking at the chat, I'm gonna just share my screen and getting ready.
So the question from June was, does the bacterial leaf scorch on red buds show from the top leaves and working downward? Not particularly, no. I haven't paid attention to the vertical distribution, but I definitely notice it on the lower foliage. So I haven't, well, maybe it's better just to say I haven't noticed it following any particular pattern of top to bottom or bottom to top. Most of the leaves of my Moonglow pear are turning black, resembles fire blight, but no shepherd's hook or scorched appearance. Could this be drought stress? There's, you don't necessarily get the shepherd's crook or shepherd's hook on the tips of the branches with fire blight. And we had a case as recently as last Friday come in that was confirmed to be fire blight. So I wouldn't rule it out. And if it's happening to individual branches instead of just a general wilt to the whole tree, then it's not going to be drought stress. So there's still a good chance that that is in fact fire blight. All right. So if there are no other questions, I will wish everyone a good rest of the month of June, and we'll look forward to seeing you in July on PPP.
And we will pray for rain all over the state, so we can have a better
Yes.
report next time.
Amen to
Thank
that.
you, Mike.
I told my mother and my brothers and their families all live up in Minnesota, and they're at Minneapolis, St. Paul. They've had over 6 inches of rain in June already. So I asked her if
How
she
is
could
that for them? Is that
send
more
some
than normal?
Yes, that is much more than normal. That's maybe double normal. So yeah, I asked her to send some here, and she's going to see what she can do about that.
Okay, yes, please. I'm getting tired of watering new plants. All right, so we will move on to our Master Gardener Program announcements. And just a reminder for everyone that after the webinar, I make the recording available, and also we share a document that has resources that were mentioned today. So you'll see some of those links that people have mentioned. We've been gathering those for you. And that comes out both in an email, and it's also posted on the EMG intranet under Continuing Education, Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. So it's there forever. So if you're thinking back to a previous presentation and you just couldn't remember, all of that is there for you to use. Well, as we've been starting all of our announcements the past few months, because this is what is keeping us very busy here at the program, the EMG College is coming up September 24th to 26th. Our theme, growing healthy plants, pollinators, and people. And now we're happy to say that registration will open in July. So we're getting all those details lined up, and we'll be able to share with you registration information very soon, the beginning of July. So speaking of EMG College, we wanted to talk to you about a couple different things. The first is becoming a sponsor. We are looking for sponsors to help offset costs of hosting the college. And this is a great opportunity for EMG groups and associations that might like to make a contribution towards this educational opportunity. So we are looking for sponsors. We're also looking to have you think of or identify potential sponsors. So are there businesses or organizations or individuals that you know of or have connections with that might like to sponsor EMG College? If so, please email us at NCEMG Program, and we'll get in touch with them. If you would like to look into all the different benefits of being a sponsor and the different levels that we've organized in terms of sponsorship, please check that out at the EMG College sponsor page, which is linked below, and also there's a QR code to that page. And speaking of gratitude and support of the EMG College, Master Gardener College, we wanted to thank the Extension Master Gardener volunteers of Durham County. They have made a donation to the scholarship fund for EMG College. So this will enable volunteers who may otherwise be unable to attend to join us. So thank you so much, Master Gardener volunteers of Durham County. All right, in other announcements, the Carolinas Horticultural Therapy Network is inviting you to join them for a free lunch and learn, an hour-long webinar coming up on July 17th. And this is a training that's going to focus on implementing advanced adaptive tools and techniques for therapeutic horticultural populations. So really focusing on tools and techniques. And the presenters will be Amy Bruchesi and Greg Stivland. So you can register at the link below. And I'll be happy to have you attend. We've got some updated web content to make you aware of. The How to Create Wildlife-Friendly Landscapes publication has been updated and expanded. This is a great publication that's kind of got a step-by-step guide on creating a wildlife-friendly landscape, and also has links to loads of resources. So we thank Chris Moorman and Pat Lindsay for updating that document. So check it out. All right, last week, NC State Master Gardener volunteers and extension agents discussed topics for participating in the Great Southeast Pollinator Census, which is coming up in August. And we called that get together a buzz session. So if you missed that buzz session, we now have the recording available and resources. So the resources are wonderful. It's going to help you to understand how you might participate individually in this opportunity, how to spread the word so others will get involved, or how to hold an educational event at your local demo garden or at a library or other place that the public could participate. It also goes over how to report your volunteer hours. So just a reminder that participating in the Great Southeast Pollinator Census is a statewide Master Gardener volunteer opportunity for which you can earn hours. So check out those recordings, that recording. But we also want you to save the date because all of the momentum is really building around this event. There will be another webinar hosted on August 15th at 1 p.m. So we invite you to save the date. That's going to be a webinar open to the public for how to get involved across the state. So another opportunity to learn about that event. And we are just sticking with this theme of pollinators today because next month on Plants, Pests, and Pathogens is going to be about preparing for the Great Southeast Pollinator Census. We thought it would be really helpful to have Matt Bertone feature a brush up session on insect ID for us because the Great Pollinator Census is about observing plants for a short period of time on those days in August and observing and identifying what pollinators visit those plants in your yard or in the demo garden. So having some fresh insect ID, we hope will be helpful to you and also help you in teaching others to understand what they might be seeing. So we are looking forward to his presentation next month. And that brings us to the end of the June Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. And we thank Elsa Youngsteadt and Hannah Levenson again for their presentations today. We hope that you've enjoyed that. And again, look for the resources in the email and on the EMG internet. So thank you, everyone. And we wish you well. We'll see you next month.
Take care, everyone.